Hi, I'm Luke Gilfillan. Welcome to the Lounge with Luke Gilfillan. Hello, and welcome to the Lounge with Luke Gilfillan. Today we only have one story, but I've got a lot to ramble about, so I'm sure you're all very excited to hear all of that. Our first story that we have is from Axios. This is by Fidel Hassan. Al-Hassan. I can't pronounce that. My apologies. I'm not very good at pronouncing names other than Stacy Sheridan, which I probably pronounce wrong anyways. It's probably like Shadian something. The headline is Senator Duckworth. We should listen to the argument on removing Washington statues. So for those of you who don't know, Senator Tammy Duckworth is one of two senators from Illinois. There's Dick Durbin, who's been around for how many years has he been our senator? Like 18? No, probably since the 90s, so like 30 years basically. And then there's Tammy Duckworth, who became our senator last election in 2018. She's very recognizable because she's an Iraq war veteran, and I believe she lost, or she was paralyzed from she's in a wheelchair, and so a lot of people can recognize her for that. She's an American hero and all, and probably the best senator we're gonna get in Illinois. But either way, she's involved in a controversy today because she told CNN's State of the Union on Sunday that we should listen to the argument for removing George Washington's statues. So, the CNN... Okay, so here's the script of what she said. Dana Bash, she's an anchor over at CNN. Senator, I know that you support change in the name of military bases named after Confederate leaders, but there are leaders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson who were slave owners, and some people are demanding their monuments come down too. In your view, where does it end? Should statues, for example, of George Washington come down? And then Duckworth said, well, let me just say that we should start off by having a national dialogue on it at some point. So national dialogue is one of politicians' favorite ways of saying that they don't support it, but they do support it, but they support, like, dialogue about it, which means that they actually support it, but they can't just come out and say it because it's unpopular, and that's basically a little trick that politicians will use all the time at some point. But right now, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. In one of our countries that are opposed to us, Russia, has put a bounty on American troops' heads. So he's pivoting away from the questions towards Trump's stance on foreign policy, which has generally been very strong, but I should probably cover the Russia bounty story, actually. I will actually cover that during this podcast, because it's a very important story, and very, very bad. So she's pivoting away from that. It's another trick that politicians will use. Though this one is so common among politicians, it's not even a trick at this point. What really struck me about this speech that the president gave at Mount Rushmore was that he spent more time worried about honoring dead Confederates than he did talking about the lives of our 13,000 Americans who lost their lives to COVID-19, or by warning Russia off the bounties that they're putting on Americans' heads. So, first off thing is a lie. There was no mention, and you should actually check out Trump's speech, because that was the most important speech of his presidency, and I was thinking about covering it on this lounge. Maybe I'll cover it like tomorrow if I do an episode on that, but that was a very, very important speech, and he said a lot of good things. He actually never mentioned Confederates during the whole speech, so that was a lie. But yeah, you should definitely look up that speech. That's probably like Ronald Reagan's Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. That was probably the equivalent to that, and obviously all the media headlines just assume you won't watch the speech and lie about what's going on during the... Well, not so much lie, because... Yeah, I guess the best description would be lie. But yeah, go watch the speech, even if you might not like what you think the content of it's going to be. It's a good speech to listen to just to know the speech, because it's going to be very important, and I don't really like predicting into the future, but I think historians of the future are going to look at that speech and analyze it. Obviously, Trump didn't write it, or it wasn't an improvised Trump speech, because those generally aren't very Lincoln-like, but this one was, and you should definitely watch it. He spent more time talking about dead Confederates than he did talking about the lives of 130,000 Americans who lost their lives to COVID-19, or by warning Russia off the bounties they're putting on Americans' heads. His priorities are all wrong here. He should be talking about what we're doing to overcome this pandemic. What are we going to do to push Russia back? Instead, he has no time for that. He spent all his time talking about dead traitors. He actually didn't, but... and then Dana Bash said, that may be true, but George Washington, I don't think anybody would call him a traitor, and there are moves by some to remove statues of him. Is that a good idea? The first line of that may be true, that's not true, that's a lie, but Dana Bash can say whatever she wants. And then Duckworth says, I think we should listen to everybody. I think we should listen to the argument there, but remember that that president at Mount Rushmore was standing on ground that was stolen from Native Americans, who had already been given that land during a treaty. So the presumption there is that Mount Rushmore is evil because it was taken from Native Americans who took that land from other Native Americans who took that land from other Native Americans. I understand the argument that Americans, or British colonials and then Americans, stole land from Native Americans, but to say that the land is now currently illegitimate because it was stolen from them back then is just, it's viewing America in a vacuum and ignoring all of human history. The fact is that cultures and civilizations have been changing lands and launching wars of conquest for 10,000 years probably. And it probably wouldn't be very logical to say that the Germans have a right to Latvia because that's where the Prussians used to live before they were kicked out by Russian peoples that would eventually become Latvians. And it just doesn't make sense to me. Or saying that the Illinois Native American tribes that inhabited Illinois during the 1700s, it would be crazy for those tribe leaders of the Illinois to say, oh, we actually own all of the Iroquois land because that's where our proto-Illinois came from, and when they migrated after the first ice age, that's where they came from, and now the land where the Iroquois currently are, that's our land. It just doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be an argument made if it were any other civilization than America, and obviously it was all very brutal because everything 100 years from now, or 100 years before now, was very brutal. You'd be very hard to find a civilization that was a very staunch defender of human rights and popular sovereignty over land, but it's just a weird argument. But either way, so we'll move on to this. So Tammy Duckworth says we should listen to everybody, which is basically her way of avoiding the question, but the fact that she's avoiding the question, this may sound like a reach, and the language I'm using is very a reach, but it is telling about where our culture is currently moving. And it brings to mind, there was when I first went to OPRF, the first class I took was a summer school class as I was transitioning to 9th grade. It was a digital literacy class, and for digital literacy, basically all you do is learn how to make like Microsoft Word, PowerPoints, and all that stuff, and how to use all the features involved in those. And it was in an English room that wasn't, the English teacher wasn't teaching it, but they used the digital literacy. The digital literacy class was taught instead of an English classroom, and on the, right above the whiteboard of the classroom, there was this big poster that said, "Not radical, just early." And so the implication of that was, it was a political message. It was saying that, sure, you may think my political beliefs are radical, but 80 years from now, those aren't going to be radical anymore. And so I'm gonna pause the thing and transition. So the implication of that is that this guy thinks there's a pattern in American history specifically, but also world history, that the ideas that are radical will always eventually take the mainstream. And in some cases, that is true. And you see, like, a lot of people my age, they'll say this. They'll say, oh, every radical belief, this will eventually become mainstream, and then I will get to tell my grandkids how I was a radical in the past, and now everyone believes these things, and look at me, I'm such a good hero and virtuous. And that is something that probably every American will think is true, but it's just a falsehood in most cases. So, and the reason I say that is because not radical, just early does apply to the American left and the left generally. So the ideology that I pertain, that's a result of the Enlightenment, like John Locke, Thomas Paine, Common Sense, that he wrote that. That's where my stuff comes from, and that was radical in the 1700s. It was very, very radical. That these people were thinking, oh, all men are created equal, life, liberty, property, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those were all very radical ideals, and those ideals were pretty much responsible for all the success that we've seen in the past 300 years as a species. The fact is that by the standards that the UN uses to monitor standards of living, the average person, or the average poor person living in America today, is living better than the average rich person living in America in the 1920s. And that's because even what we would consider poor in America, those people still have typically a TV, a microwave, and sometimes a house or a trailer. But those things, that TV, microwave, that would only be available to the wealthiest of the wealthy in those days. And you can get basically foods that would be out of reach to the average person in 1920 at relatively low cost in America today. And that's an accomplishment that's due to the primarily to the economic systems of capitalism, which prioritize efficiency and innovation in every in every way imaginable. The fact that we have institutions in America that average a 7 to 8% growth rate, that I'm referring to the stock market, that is insane by human standards. So let's say we had an institution that was growing at 8% starting 10,000 years ago, like we have now. So let's say the average person is worth $100 total. That's their entire net worth back 10,000 years ago. If that net worth were to grow by 8% every year for 10,000 years, you'd get an overflow on the calculator. I don't know why it overflowed. No idea why that overflowed. Okay. You'd get an overflow on the calculator in terms of the material wealth you would have. And we're going to see that trend continue, and perhaps that 8% will become 10% in 200 years, and humanity will grow and innovate in ways that have been unforeseen in human history, and it's happening right now. There are people that say, oh, there was the first industrial revolution, second industrial revolution, and now we're in the third industrial revolution. These 200 years, if you were to put them in the history of humanity, we are a tiny sliver, but the amount of innovation we've done in that small amount of time is incredible. I mean, if you were living in like the 13th century, you'd expect your quality of life and how you went about your day to be pretty much exactly the same from the time you were born to the time you died. That is not the case for now. There's probably more innovation every year than there was in the past, in 100 years, 1,000 years from now. And it's crazy. There's a new iPhone every year, basically, or 2 years, whatever. And there's like 23 new cameras or features added to those every day, and that the iPhone is a very, very important part of our life, or at least in America. And that innovation is due to those ideals. So either way, after the initial wave of the Enlightenment, and then you had America founded, and then once America was founded, you had a lot of other civilizations transition from feudalism and monarchy, which was the status quo for basically all of human history, feudalism and monarchy. And then America was basically responsible for that transition, and that's something we should be proud of. And then after that transition, from there, you still had actually a few monarchies, and I guess I'll go back to the Russian Revolution, or no, French Revolution actually is probably the first one. But you had a lot of movements that were, actually the French Revolution was kind of Enlightenment, but it used post-Enlightenment tactics, I guess is the best word. So then you had the post-Enlightenment, which was where you saw Marxism arise. They thought they were just a continuation of the Enlightenment values of John Locke, but taken further. And fascism, you saw that arise. And the creators of fascism, or the creator of fascism, who actually was someone who studied under Karl Marx, he thought that he was also an extension of the Enlightenment. So you had America, which was basically founded on the original Enlightenment ideals, and those ideals had basically spread to most of the world. And then you had the post-Enlightenment ideals, which had arisen. And so you had this rift coming out. So post-Enlightenment ideals, that's Marxism, and then post-Enlightenment ideals, that's where you saw like the Russian Revolution crop up. They're like, oh, we're continuing the Enlightenment, and you may think that Marxism is radical now, but so was the original Enlightenment, and so in their view, they were not radical, just early, and that's the little thing. And I'm not saying that the guy who put the sign up was a Marxist or whatever. That's not the implication, but that's basically the view that when a radical idea emerges, because the Enlightenment ideals eventually spread across the globe, that the radical ideals are good and will eventually spread across the globe. And that didn't really happen. You did see Marxism spread across the globe for a brief period of time and then falter, and the same thing with fascism. And I guess the main divider between the post-Enlightenment thinkers and the Enlightenment thinkers is that the Enlightenment thinkers had a set of ideals, and obviously by the time that the post-Enlightenment happened, all the original Enlightenment thinkers were dead, so who knows, maybe the original Enlightenment thinkers would eventually become Marxist or something. Maybe Thomas Jefferson was a big fan of Karl Marx, would be a big fan of Karl Marx or something. But they died. And so you saw this rift between the people who saw the Enlightenment ideals, thought they were good ideals, and wanted to spread those ideals to everyone on Earth, which they didn't do originally. Obviously, there were still people enslaved in 1776, but eventually those slaves would be freed on the basis of the ideals in the Declaration of Independence of all men are created equal, which actually, if you read John C. Calhoun, who was basically like a big Confederate leader before the Confederacy really emerged as a actual rebellion, he thought that the Declaration of Independence was all like, oh, wishy-washy ideals that didn't really matter, and what really mattered was the Constitution. And the Constitution didn't apply to African Americans, but abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and others, they were saying, no, these are the ideals of the American Revolution, and we haven't lived up to them, and we should live up to them, like we promised to in 1776. So that was a big debate between them at the time. I'm rambling, aren't I? This is, well, I mean, I admit that, but I don't know if it's good rambling or bad rambling. We'll figure it out. We'll figure all that out. And so this rift emerged between people who were in favor of the Enlightenment and they thought these are good values, let's stick to them and go forward. And then there were people who say the Enlightenment was a good just starting off point for getting to further post-Enlightenment values. And so that's where the rift between like Bernie Sanders progressives and Calvin Coolidge conservatives are. And so I guess what I'm trying to say here is the not radical, just early idea only applies to the American progressives, because among American progressives, things that were normal like or things that were radical 5 years ago will eventually come into the mainstream among American progressives. And among American conservatives, they have been fairly or libertarian conservatives. There's like a little moving around as to where the conservatives go. There's like the populists, which would best be shown in like Josh Hawley or something, and they take over every now and then. And Trump was originally supposed to be in that branch, but since he's moved to like a mix of the populists and the nationalist conservative. And when I say nationalist, that's basically, it's not like supposed to be a fascist thing, but that's just what they call it. That's like nationalist conservative. That's George W. Bush. You could probably see that in Ted Cruz. And so Trump is basically a mix between Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley. He's somewhere in between there. And then there's the libertarian conservatives. That's probably Mike Lee, senator from Utah. And the presidents that were like that was Ronald Reagan and Calvin Coolidge. And none of you know who Calvin Coolidge is, which is very unfortunate. You should actually Wikipedia Calvin Coolidge right now if you have the time, and just go through the entire thing, because that Wikipedia does a good job of basically putting who he is down and whatever. And there are segments of the right who have been consistent since the days of Calvin Coolidge, like on everything probably except for tariffs. Like, go to Wikipedia. If you read Calvin Coolidge policies, they're exactly the same as like someone like me would hold. And that includes things on like civil rights. Calvin Coolidge was a big civil rights activist, but he didn't really like do much because he wasn't. It was sort of like actually he said a lot about it, but he did not actually pass any legislation that would put him in the history books for it, because he wasn't really a guy that was thinking the federal government is going to change things. He was just like, federal government's job is to enforce the Constitution, stay out of your way, and let the states, if you want to pass like labor laws, leave that up to the states, or anti-discrimination laws. Or actually, I think he was in favor of anti-discrimination laws federally because that was under the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. That was that, but you can Wikipedia him. And so, like, my ideals and whatever, that's been around since the 1920s, like, exactly the same. But you would never be able you couldn't even in the 1990s in Obama, there were certain segments of the American left, they can't even relate to Obama, because that not radical, just early phrase, that applies to them. Because the things that are radical on the American left, they tend to come to the mainstream every 5 years. And basically every American knows this. They're like, oh, we don't know what's going to be normal in 20 years. And that's because the not radical, just early phrase does apply to the left. And so if you keep getting a American left which stagnates, and you'll see a lot of people saying that the right like goes extreme every now and then and like switches around, and that's true because it's switching between these three populist, nationalist conservative, and libertarian conservative groups. It does that all the time. And so if you move to a Trump mix between populism and nationalist conservatism, you could see that as, oh, you're moving to the right, which I guess is true, but those three groups tend to remain stagnant. Actually, the populist group, it goes all over the place. That's the one exception to that's the not radical, just early rule on the right, probably them. But among some groups, you've had people that have been consistent for the past 100 years. And if you want to go so far back as to the Enlightenment, I guess you could say it's been consistent for 300 years, but probably not nearly as consistent as the past 100 years. But if you keep getting I don't know if the camera inverts it, so I don't know if I'm getting the sides wrong, but if you keep getting a conservative wing that goes like this, and then you get a liberal wing that goes like this, well, they just slowly move out, not really slowly, pretty rapidly. They slowly move out to the left, and the conservatives just switch around three groups. Then you're eventually going to get some strong divisions, and that's what we're seeing right now. These strong divisions are coming to a forefront, and part of that is because of Trump. Trump is a very polarizing figure, and so you'll see a lot of people who would... And so, for example, Trump's Mount Rushmore speech, I'd say about 90% of that is something that Obama has probably said word for word, but you'll still see media outlets covering some of those aspects as very controversial, like going to Mount Rushmore, saying that we have a great history of justice, liberty, and all those things, and we're going to live up to those ideals and whatever. Those are things that Obama has said, and you could probably find speeches that quote him basically word for word is what Trump is saying. But either way, those things are kind of controversial. They actually don't agree with them, but because Trump is saying it, they just have to just agree with that. And Trump is partially responsible for the acceleration of the moving farther to the left of Democrats, Democrats. No, that's Joe Biden is basically the same person as Obama was in 2008, probably a little more moderate, but among the progressive base, that's like Bernie Sanders, they do move very far. Actually, the not radical, just early phrase does not apply to moderate Democrats, which make up probably like 50% of the party, and then the rest is splintered within different groups. But among progressives, which are the people that I interact with, and I don't know, there are people that watch my podcast that are like relatives of mine and whatever, and to me, and to them, it probably seems crazy because it is somewhat crazy what I'm saying. But among the people I interact with at my high school, they are all the not radical, just early crowd rather than like the normal Joe Biden Democrat. And I'm reaching here. I'm reaching very far. I know it sounds crazy. It is crazy. But yeah, I don't know. I saw. I had to download Instagram today because I had to post something for one of the clubs I'm in. We're running like a social media account to like get attention towards a club, and it's part of our little. It's like an activism club, so I'm involved with that and whatever. And so I had to write a post. And so apparently this account is like following a bunch of people that the other person that runs a club with me, they know. And the first thing that came up, like on the feed, I was trying to navigate the thing because I have no idea how to use Instagram at all. But I eventually figured it out, and posted the post and immediately deleted Instagram right after. But there was this post, and it was this girl. She apparently they just like take pictures of themselves on Instagram, and then the caption is what really matters. And so the caption said, "Hope y'all are." Signing your petitions today. There are a lot of petitions that go around young people that don't actually do anything, but it makes people feel good, which is 90% of what they do anyways. All the political activism is just to make them feel good or to virtue signal to their friends. It said, "Hope y'all are doing your petitions today. I'm so effing tired of this country. I hate America so much." And then there was a Canadian flag, and then that was the end of the post, and there were like 60 comments, and all of them were like, "Keep doing well, Queen. You're doing a great thing," and all those other things. Just to, what's the term? I guess the term is circle jerk. That's basically what the comments were. I only read like 2 of them, um, before figuring out how to post the thing. But that is basically the people I interact with. They're like, oh, they don't. They don't like America. And I know it's a phrase that has been used for probably decades at this point and was not true. I guess who comes to mind is the McCarthy guy, who would accuse people of hating America and being like communists, and that was a big issue. But I and I wish it wasn't true, but I mean, when you start saying that stuff. Okay. Sorry, I just saw quite a funny thing. But if you say it openly, they don't like America, and that's who I interact with, and luckily they don't constitute a majority of people whatsoever. But I think they will, unfortunately, in the next 10 years, constitute a larger majority of the American population. And so, that's basically all I have to say on the not radical, just early. Basically, my main takeaway, or the takeaway that I'm trying to get people to get from that, is not radical, just early only applies to some groups of the American politic, and the rest of us have been consistent since 1920. Alright, thanks so much for listening, and goodbye. Oh, and the reason I brought up the Senator Duckworth thing is because I wanted to show that it was starting to get into the mainstream. Also, watch the Trump speech. Not that it's going to, like, teach you anything, but I think it's fairly important, even if you don't like what he says in it. Alright, thanks so much for listening, and goodbye.